Hello, everyone, and welcome to Talk Nerdy. Today is Monday, December 1st, 2025, and I'm the host of the show, Dr. Cara Santa Maria. We are approaching the holiday season. It's the last month of 2025. I don't know how you feel about that. Some people are saying good riddance to this year. Other people are saying time is just moving much too quickly. We've got two more shows for you after this one next Monday on the 8th, another the following Monday on the 15th, and then we take 2 weeks every year for hiatus. This year they're falling on the 22nd and the 29th of December, so that's over the sort of holiday break for a lot of you. I'm really excited about this week's episode. It's an interesting. I think the coming episodes they're interesting. They're sort of ethically and morally complex. Hopefully, they spark a lot of questions, a lot of conversations with you and your friends and your loved ones. This week, I had the opportunity to speak with Melanie D. Kaplan. She wrote a book called Lab Dog, A Beagle and His Human Investigate the Surprising World of Animal Research. So Melanie is an independent journalist. She has covered travel and science writing, but also a lot of other general journalism for a lot of outlets that you read: Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, National Parks Magazine. She went to Columbia J School, and she was also an MIT Night Science Journalism Fellow. And she's a dog person. We shared photos of our dogs. She wrote this really fascinating book about her dog, who named Hammy, great name, who also happened to have been bred and utilized for biomedical research. And so it's a fascinating and really personal take on the ethics of animal research. So without any further ado, here she is, Melanie D. Kaplan. Well, Melanie, thank you so much for joining me today.
Well, thanks for inviting me. This is really fun.
Yeah, so I have to admit, okay, there's so much to talk about, but when your book came across my desk, so it's called Lab Dog, A Beagle and His Human Investigate the Surprising World of Animal Research. I have to admit, I don't even know why I assumed, but probably because this is a science show, that at first blush, I assumed that you were a researcher who has, dogs in your lab, and that you were going to share about that experience. And then I realized, no, you have a dog who actually lived in a research lab, was a research dog, and then you, as a journalist, decided to investigate, what is that life like? What is the world of animal research today? Where's it going? And basically, what was your little guy's life like before he came to live with you? And so this angle is so different, and I've got to admit, like, way more interesting. So I'm very excited. I'm very excited to talk to you today.
Well, I love that was ambiguous for you, because that never has crossed my mind, and I haven't heard that from anyone else. But that's good. I love it.
Well, and I think because I came from the world of bench science first, like I was a neuroscientist before I went back to school to become a clinical psychologist. So now I work with people, but I've worked with mice and birds. Those were my main research animals. When I was in a cell culture facility, I was working with embryonic mice. And when I was in a lab in New York, we were doing songbird research with finches. And so I have like quite a nuanced relationship with animal research. I fear sometimes that the general public, their gut reaction is all animal research is bad. It's all cruel. It's all abuse. We shouldn't do it for any reason under any circumstances. And what I love is your balanced approach to this topic, because I think that speaks more to the reality of what's happening in scientific laboratories.
Well, thanks for saying that. I appreciate it. I think that you're right. The gut reaction is it's bad. This is torture. But also people just have no idea, because, I'm a journalist, and I lived with this dog for many years before I dug into it, and I had no idea. And to say that this animal research is happening is one thing, but it's just, we don't know why we're doing it. We don't know what's actually happening in the labs or how many animals. There's just so many questions. And at a certain point, I was like, okay, I need to understand this because I'm just a curious person and writing about things is my profession. And I couldn't put it off any longer.
I love it. And so before we get into Hammy, into your dog, I want to know a little more about how you got to where you are right now and how you basically acquired the skills to be able to do sort of an investigative piece like this and make it into a long form book, because you are a journalist. And I mean, you studied in J school, you were a night science journalism fellow. So like science journalism has been your beat, right?
Well, I've been mostly a generalist. So I've been freelancing as a journalist for more than 20 years. And one of the things I love about it is that I could write about everything. And if somebody asked me to do a story and it's interesting to me, or it pays well, I usually say yes. And I love learning about different things. So before I started this, I was actually doing a lot of travel writing, some science writing, some writing about animals, but I've never had a beat per se. And I have to say, going into this, I felt a little impostery because here I was with these scientific papers in front of me, like barely able to read them and talking to these researchers and trying to translate it into my head into simple English. And at the end of the day, for many years, my brain just felt like it was about to explode.
Yeah, it's definitely something that we talk about. I mean, I won't take the conversation too far down this rabbit hole, but it's something we talk about a lot in sort of the confluence in that space where there's a confluence of science communication and science journalism. This idea that specialists are necessary and that, because a lot of desks have, or a lot of like outlets have closed their science desks, what generalists are faced with doing is learning how to read the scientific literature, which is not an easy task, right?
Exactly. And I think as a generalist, I've been tasked with this in many industries and fields over the years. You just dive into something and you know nothing about it, and you ask enough questions and you talk to the right people, and all of a sudden you're like an expert for 5 minutes and you can talk about it at the dinner party and then you forget it all. So, I mean, I'm kind of used to doing that, but this obviously was a much, much bigger project than I'd ever worked on.
And so I'm curious, as somebody who had written about, a lot of things, but science was included, I'd love to know, like, I'm thinking back to when I did my dissertation, which, this is really going to get in the weeds, but I did what's called a qualitative investigation, a phenomenological investigation where, I mean, I was focusing on a totally different topic, medical aid in dying. But one of the important things that Heidegger and some of the architects of this type of research ask for researchers to do is to make their sort of implicit biases as explicit as possible. Dig deep, figure out what your views are, what your thoughts are, what your gut reactions are to the topic before you get into it, and then see how your research has changed your mind and make all of that really explicit throughout the process. Because, Heidegger's view was nobody is unbiased. You can try to be unbiased, but the best way to do that is to actually be transparent, not to put your biases on the shelf. And so I'm curious, thinking about that approach, how did you go in to learning about animal research? Were you one of those like, oh, this is bad and I am going into this thinking it's awful? Were you pretty open-minded? Did you even have an opinion?
It's funny you say that. So a friend of mine interviewed me at the beginning of the process and asked me some of those questions. She had done some of that kind of work, and she wanted to document and record this conversation about where I was at the beginning. And, I think from the beginning, I did have an open mind, and I was very clear with everyone that I was pro Hammy. So that is my bias. I love this beagle. I never wanted to imagine him in a lab. I never wanted anything bad to happen to him. And And so that really was, a big overarching thing in my approach to this. But
Hmm.
at the same time, I really wanted to understand both sides. And I want to understand what the activists were saying and what the researchers were saying, and why it takes so long to make change in this field. And so I just went out and talked to as many people as I could. And I think my feelings about it probably didn't change drastically, but now I can actually explain. Now I understand why this is so complicated. I understand much more of the nuance, and I'm glad I went into it with an open mind.
Yeah. So tell me a little bit more about Hammy. Not so much about his past, which we're going to get into, but like how old was he when you adopted him, and when you did start sort of your life with him, what did you know?
So I adopted him in 2013, and he was almost 4. And he came out of a lab in Virginia, and that's all I knew. He was with 6 other beagles. They were all named after founding fathers. So he was Alexander Hamilton. And, I met all of the other foster parents that day that they got out of the lab. And we could see right away they had different personalities. I mean, one didn't want people even coming up to him, and another one was kind of running around this backyard trying to figure out how to get out. And Hammy was the one who went right for the treat bag. So I was like, oh, he is food motivated.
Easy to
So
train.
yes, exactly. So I brought him home as a foster, and he was really scared of everything, just
Mm.
walking around the neighborhood. I live in Washington, D.C., and the noises scared him, and different things that would pop in front of him, like a balloon blowing around, would terrify him. And it really took quite a while until we could have just a normal routine of going out for a walk.
What made you, I mean, so you knew from the beginning that he had been in a lab. What, like, first of all, how did you even approach like the foster and then the adoption possibility?
I found out about an organization that works to get these dogs out of labs, and it's a very small percentage. One number that I heard was that 6%, this was just at one university, 6% of the beagles were adopted out, and the others are euthanized.
Hmm.
So very few of them get adopted out. But if they're healthy when the study is finished, then often they do adopt them out. And that's becoming law in a bunch of states. So I found out about this organization. I wanted to foster a dog because I didn't know anything about it. And again, I was just curious and wanted to learn a little bit about this world, and wanted to have one of these dogs in my life, and figured he would go off and be adopted by someone else.
Hmm.
And, a month later, I signed the adoption papers.
And so why beagles? Like, is that obviously that's probably something that you got into as you start? I'm skipping a little bit around as you got into your research, but what is it about beagles specifically that, makes them lab dogs?
What I kept hearing over and over again is that beagles are used because they're docile and friendly and compliant, and that's all true. But what I learned when I really started digging into it is that we had in this country a real system of breeding beagles for hunting.
Hmm.
Beagles were brought here after the Civil War from England, and people would go beagling, which is hunting down rabbits with your beagle. And so there were a lot of kennels that were breeding beagles and trying to breed a healthier beagle or a better beagle for hunting. And so at a certain point, they pivoted and started breeding a better beagle. This is a tongue twister, for pharmaceutical testing and for radiation testing, which happened in the 1950s and 60s. And then they had a whole system of breeding beagles, and they had these kennels and the infrastructure. And then the beagle became the go-to dog for really all of testing and research.
Interesting. I know that like I've spent quite a bit of time in the UK and obviously working dogs. Working dogs exist here too, but working dogs are a very big culture in the UK. Hunting is a big culture in the UK. And so you do see different types of working dogs, retrievers and pointers and, different dogs that are sort of bred to have a job or herders even, like herding dogs are huge. And so it's interesting that beagles specifically ended up as one of the kind of common laboratory animals because of that long genetic history of being bred for work, because there are a lot of other breeds that were also bred for work.
Yeah, and they certainly have used and still use other breeds. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
dachshunds have been used for medical research, and greyhounds and golden retrievers. Um, so there's definitely other dogs. I think at the beginning it was kind of which breeds were accessible and already bred. And I'm sure there was a cost factor involved. So if you have a greyhound, that greyhound's going to eat more than the beagles. That's going to make the
Mm.
cost of just caring for the animals more expensive. So, and the beagles, didn't take up much room. You didn't need to have a giant facility for giant dogs. You just had kind of small, medium dogs.
But what about the annoyance factor? Because beagles are howlers. And like the researchers must have had to calculate that in.
They are howlers. Yeah. So, well, the sad thing is that for a long time, it was common practice to cut the vocal cords of the
Yeah.
dogs.
Oh, that's sad.
And, I asked a lot of people because I was told that Hammy's vocal cords were cut, and the vet said that the vocal cords could grow back and he might howl one day. And sure enough, he howled one day, and I was so happy.
Mm-hmm.
And then I started really wondering, like, were his vocal cords cut? And a lot of people, even in the animal rights movement, say this really doesn't happen as much as it used to. Often you'd have dogs in med schools because all the med schools had a dog lab, which they don't anymore.
Mm-hmm.
So they needed them to be quiet. They couldn't have their classrooms right down the hall from howling dogs, and so they did that. And I think it's still happening, but not nearly as much.
Ah, okay. And so, yeah, because that sounds absolutely horrible. But when we say used to, I mean, obviously you said it still does happen, but not that much. Is this like a pretty antiquated practice, or were people doing this like not that long ago?
It's not antiquated, unfortunately.
Okay.
It's yeah, and even lab dogs aside, there are still states that allow this to happen just if people are bothered by their dog barking too much or their neighbors bothered. Some states have prohibited it, and they just won't allow it to happen unless it's for a medical reason.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, it still does happen. And, for dogs, this is their way of communicating. And so it just seems sad in so many ways.
Yeah, definitely. And so, you get Hammy, and obviously, I mean, I think we should just say this right at the front. You mentioned did you say he was 4 or 3?
He was almost 4.
He was okay, so 3 going on 4, and this was in 2013. So obviously, because we know that the saddest part of living and loving our dogs is that they don't last forever. I imagine that Hammy is not now. What would that make him? Like 18 years old? Yeah.
So Hammy would have been 16 now. I
Oh,
lost
16.
him 2 years ago. And, I had this idea that, of course, he was going to live forever. And of course, he was going to be on book tour with me. And
Oh.
when I was writing this, I was writing Hammy all in the present tense.
Mm,
And then when I lost him, it was just the hardest writing I'd ever done, is to kind of write about that chapter.
yeah.
And then I had to go back and change everything to the past tense. And it was just, on one hand, amazing to like have all that to work through my grieving,
Mhm.
but it was also just gut wrenching many days.
Oh, I can imagine. I'm, full disclosure, I'm recording this with my little guy Killer. He is curled up. He's smaller than a beagle. He looks like a cross between, I'd say, a miniature dachshund and a Papillon, but he's not. Or at least I don't know how much I trust the DNA test, but they say that he's a poodle Lhasa Apso Chihuahua / mixed beyond recognition. He's very, very mixed. But he's 15. He turned 15 in May, and he's still kind of going strong. So like
That's
he's surprising
amazing.
me. Yeah, with how much energy. Still takes the stairs, still runs up and down all day. So yeah, that's a tough it's a tough time to know that sort of any minute. And you don't know. Like sometimes you're checking in the mornings to make sure that they're still there. Anytime that you go out of town, you're like, here's the emergency vet, because we're, dogs don't live much longer than this.
Yeah, I know.
Ugh,
They do not live long enough. So
I
just
know.
keep enjoying every minute with Killer.
Absolutely. And gosh, what an homage to Hammy. I mean, I can't imagine a better way to sort of immortalize someone, some little guy that you loved so much. So tell me, how long did it take, do you think, from the time you first fostered him until you felt, I mean, obviously everybody feels bonded immediately, but until you felt like he adjusted or adapted, or there was some kind of normalcy of the classic home environment for Hammy versus, what he grew up the first few years of his life in?
It was definitely months before he
Mm-hmm.
was not anxious all the time. And it was hard for me to measure that because I just saw him every day, but I would have friends come to the house a couple years later and they're like, "Oh my God, he is so confident. I can't believe how different he is."
Mm,
But his whole life, he would be startled by sounds, or we'd go to a new place and he would start trembling. So certain things still triggered him. And, I don't know if they reminded him of sounds or smells in the lab, or if it just, there was something in the lab that in his mind, just loud noises in general would take him back. I don't know exactly what he was experiencing, but I knew when he was scared, of course. And I just did my best his whole life just to comfort him and make him feel safe and special, because he was really special. It's like,
yeah.
the fact that he got out of this one environment that none of us can imagine, and he got to be in a home. I felt pretty lucky to have that time with him.
Oh, it's also so difficult. I mean, we talk about this all the time with like human psychology, which is my field. This difficulty understanding the interplay of nature and nurture, understanding the difference between, sort of genetic predisposition, life experiences. Is there such a thing as a core personality for a person? Is there such a thing as a disposition for a dog? How much can that be? Obviously a lot, like mostly, I believe it can be influenced and changed by experience. But it is interesting that there do appear to, at least to some extent, to be some core traits that certain breeds might have, or that some dogs, just no matter what you do, they're like really bold, and other dogs, no matter how they're trained or how they're cared for, they're like very, very timid. And so it must have been interesting for you throughout his life, trying to tease apart the difference between a sort of reaction to early experience and just like who Hammy was.
Right, exactly. And that first day when we saw them all in that yard, you could see that they had different personalities, even if they were in the same environment to begin with. And then they all went to different homes. Some went to the country, and Hammy came to an urban environment without any other dogs in the home. We would see dog friends in the neighborhood, but he wasn't living with dogs and playing with dogs every day. And so, yeah, I mean, they all had different experiences once they were adopted, and became very different dogs. But
Yeah.
because I was doing so much travel writing and he was so scared, I was like, how am I going to take you in the car, dude? Like, you can't even leave the house. And eventually I would just keep pushing him a little bit beyond his comfort zone. And, we'd get in a car and go to a hotel somewhere or stay with friends. And he would just be so scared at the beginning. And, I just remember so clearly from the last few years reporting for this book, we would get to a hotel room and he would be jumping from one bed to the other, and I would hide treats around the room and would play hide and seek. And, it's like he lived there. I mean, he just was so much more comfortable in his later years.
Oh, oh, I love it. And so let's kind of get back into some of the things that you learned. Did you find out what kind of lab Hammy was in? Were you able to find out his particular experience?
I was not.
Mm-hmm.
I do know what university he came from in Virginia, and he was at a veterinary school. They do a lot of research at the vet schools, and have purchased beagles from the facility that he was born at. But when I went to request the records, they said that they only kept records for 3 years, so they didn't have them anymore.
Mm.
So unfortunately, I did not find that, because my dream at the beginning was to track down the person who conducted research on him, and that never happened. But I found some good surrogates.
Yeah, yeah. And so when you started to dig into the experience of, let's say, beagles or even lab dogs in general, what did you learn about the type of research or the types of labs that they are often utilized in? I guess I'm curious about the distinction, because I think a lot of people, when they think of animal research, they think of like gratuitous, like cosmetic testing or things like that. And there's sort of a difficulty understanding the difference between, let's say, like you mentioned before, like a gross anatomy lab or a pharmaceutical drug testing laboratory, um, or other types of animal research.
Yeah, I'm glad you asked that, because when I first adopted him, cosmetics testing was one of the things that the organization said, oh, he might have been used for this. And in my research, I found that we've actually won that battle over the cosmetics testing.
Mm-hmm.
There is some animal testing that still happens for cosmetics, but for the most part, not in this country. Is what I was
Mm-hmm.
told. And dogs were really never used on a regular basis for cosmetics testing. Um, what happens is sometimes there's a company that is selling, say, their products in China, and China still requires animal testing. That's just hypothetical, because this is changing all the time, and I couldn't possibly keep track of what's all these global laws. But the cosmetics thing is really not an area where dogs have been used for the most part. So the big areas are basic research. So, scientists just having a question about cardiovascular disease, and putting a dog on a treadmill and testing a medical device, or testing to see, how some drug affects a dog that's been given diabetes or made to have diabetes. Then drugs are all tested still on one rodent and one non-rodent species. And the non-rodent is usually a dog or a primate.
Mm-hmm.
And pesticides, toxicity testing on dogs is pretty common. It's still required for every new pesticide that comes to market. There's a 90-day test on dogs that still happens, and they just give them huge doses, and then they euthanize them and look at their tissues and organs. So I think those are the big areas. Like I said, med schools used to use dogs a lot. They don't anymore. They don't use any live animals in North American med schools. But I know some of the advanced medical training, they are still using live animals.
And the dogs are bred for this purpose? Like, do they come from a very specific? I know when I was working in labs where we use laboratory mice or laboratory birds, there are like lines of mice. They're like a genetically engineered line of mice that, let's say you're a cancer researcher, you want mice that have a particular type of cancer, a particular type of tumor. We didn't do that kind of research where I was. We wanted sort of vanilla mice, like normal, healthy mice. And so we use like Sprague Dolly mice that are, bred for that purpose. They're specifically, that you're sort of getting the same genetic information with each mouse so that you can compare your studies to one another pretty well. Are dogs bred the same way?
Yeah, I'm familiar with the, well, no, they are not.
Hmm.
I'm familiar with the mice. I remember going on the Jackson Lab website and just blown away by the, I mean, what is it, hundreds or thousands of strains of mice you can order?
Yeah, that doesn't surprise me. I mean, it's probably very similar to cell lines because before we could make cell lines, we had mice.
So there aren't strains of beagles like mice, but they do breed them in these massive industrial breeding facilities with thousands of dogs. And if you're a lab and say you want to buy a beagle that's already comfortable, they have these slings that you might put a dog in to just make them more accessible if you are doing something to them, like maybe, giving them a shot or taking blood. So
Right.
some of the breeding facilities will train a beagle to be comfortable in a sling, or they might have them trained on a treadmill, or things
Mm-hmm.
that the labs might want their dogs to have when they arrive. And then the facilities, the breeders tattoo their ears and sell them at a pretty young age to the labs.
So in a way, it's less like I imagine, my experience was in a research lab with mice or with birds where these are sort of like genetically engineered organisms, the same as you would see with fruit flies, and more almost like livestock. Like they're almost being treated the way that we treat farm animals.
Yeah, sometimes they call them beagle farms too.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just such a massive operation that obviously they're not getting individual attention. And in Vigo, the facility that closed in 2022, their basic sanitation was just really problematic. There were bugs in the food, and the dogs were getting in fights and not getting medical care, and they were understaffed. So it is a lot like livestock in that sense.
Yeah, it's such a. I mean, obviously, I'm jumping around here, but it's such a bigger, I guess, ethical and moral question that every person has to grapple with themselves, but also at a societal and an institutional level. Because I think where the nuance comes in, it's very easy to take a stance. I mean, we all have, especially those of us who have pets, like an immediate emotional reaction, which maybe it is completely valid that, like, this is horrible. Like, how could we possibly treat our loved ones this way? But then it requires a sort of cordoning off in our minds of how we treat our food sources and a cordoning off of our minds of how, where that cutoff is for us. I often argue that it's perfectly acceptable moral stance to be against animal research, but then you have to understand that like fruit flies are also animals. Like there are levels within animal research. And so I think for a lot of philosophers, scientists, ethicists, it's about choosing where that cutoff is. Like for me, I'm very, very anti primate and, elephant and dolphin research. I think that dogs, I actually haven't formulated a full opinion, so I'm glad to be talking to you about this. But like, it's interesting how we choose which animals we elevate to be sort of not appropriate, and which animals we're somehow sort of okay with being engaged in animal research.
Absolutely. And if you look at the Animal Welfare Act from 1966,
Hmm.
that still only includes a very small number of species. It's the
Hmm.
primates and dogs and cats and rabbits and pigs and ferrets, but none of the mice and rats, birds, fish, fruit flies, any invertebrates.
Hmm.
And of course, they're all animals. And we know so many of these animals feel pain and have
Hmm.
personalities and fears. And people who have had pet rats love their rats and they say they're really smart. And so, I think being able to tell this story of this one dog, this is just one out of millions, tens of millions of animals that's being used. But then when you look at animals that we eat, I mean, research animals are just a very small drop in the bucket compared to, animals that are raised for food.
Yeah, I'm curious, and I don't know if you have like numbers off the top of your head, but I guess my assumption was that even though dogs were systematically used in animal research, that in the sort of absolute numbers, it's a tiny fraction of the number of dogs that are in household pets, or even just like languishing in shelters or are feral on the streets.
Yeah, I don't have those numbers off the top of
Mm,
my head. I know there are 40,000 dogs in research today,
hmm
and that number's gone down quite a bit. But then if you look at rats and mice, there's been estimates everything from 15 million a year to more than 100 million a year. So
mm-hmm.
it's a lot more of those animals. And of course, those animals aren't counted because they're not regulated by the USDA.
Interesting. And even just a cursory kind of search, ASPCA is reporting around 4 million dogs entering a shelter each year, but that's obviously a fluctuating number because many of them are getting adopted or sometimes euthanized.
Hmm.
Let's see, data from the Shelter Animals Court said that in 2024, they estimated closer to 6 million. Oh, but that's dogs and cats. Yeah, so about 4 million or just under 4 million dogs. In shelters. But of course, I don't think that's an appropriate comparison because we don't know, how quickly these dogs are placed or if they ever are placed or at what stage of their life they're going into shelters. Whereas in laboratory dogs, these dogs are, purpose bred for this, right? They're not being taken from shelters.
No, there is. I think one state, Oklahoma, last time I checked, still has a system where the shelter dogs can end up in research because this is the whole reason the Animal Welfare Act was passed because animals were being stolen from backyards and taken from shelters and put into research. And so that really doesn't happen anymore in
Mm-hmm.
most places. These are purpose bred dogs. They're genetically similar, and it allows the researchers to take them into the lab and know that they don't have diseases. And so that's how it works.
What's I'm curious what you learned about that policy because you mentioned early on that some dogs are euthanized at the end of their I guess their service, their research, and some dogs are adopted out. Is that like a facility to facility decision or are there sort of standards for when a dog unfortunately has to be euthanized due to the I guess toxicity of the drug or the illness that happens as a result of the research?
Right now, from what I understand, each facility decides, but in 17 states, a law has been passed saying that they have to adopt dogs and cats out after research if they're able to be adopted. But the facility decides if they're able to be adopted. And one of the problems with these laws is that we still don't really have numbers on, okay, how many are you adopting out and what is the measure for, whether this dog gets euthanized or sent to a home. And, I think without those numbers, it's really still hard to know exactly what's happening. I think
Mm-hmm.
the universities, for a while, the ones that have been doing it for years, they were kind of doing it quietly and they would adopt them to friends and family of university staff and students. And that's kind of the way that they would probably like to keep it because
Mm-hmm.
they don't want the public knowing that they're doing dog research. I mean, nobody's advertising that. And I think in their mind, it only leads to people coming and doing protests or writing books about it.
How did it's interesting because as we mentioned in the beginning, there's sort of a stereotype of this like dyed in the wool anti-activist stance when it comes to animal research. But you were able to talk to individuals, you were able to talk to organizations. How do you go into a conversation like that from a more nuanced stance, like you mentioned, from an open-minded stance, to be able to encourage and engage, because I have a feeling a lot of these labs would like to be able to talk about the work that they do. From their perspective, it's very important work, but they know that there is just I guess like a political distaste for it.
Yeah, I think there's some researchers who really would like to talk, and they were stopped by the university, the communications office, the gatekeepers, who have said, we do not want to talk about this. We don't want that out there. So, when I approached researchers, I always shared some of my previous work, and I told them what I was trying to do. And that is, really tell all sides of this story and how important it was to hear different voices and hear their story. And that, that is important to me to get it right. And there's one researcher I spent quite a bit of time talking to, and I went to his home, and he didn't want his name or university's name used. And we talked many times before he agreed to that. And, he had to get to the point where he could trust me. And I think he still might have had his guard up a little bit. But, I needed to hear from someone who had spent a career studying dogs, and I wanted to hear where they were coming from.
Mm-hmm. Were you able to find any or speak directly with any individuals who were adamantly sort of pro animal research and felt like, listen, I need to share why this is a justified approach?
Sure. The dog researchers that I talked to both felt very good about their research. They were not apologizing for it. I don't think they regretted it. And then I talked to other people who spent time researching on animals and then stepped away, realized that this isn't where they wanted to be in history. They became ethicists or started working at PETA. And they were also really interesting to talk to because they've been on both sides, and they know what it's like to euthanize hundreds of mice and or work down the hall from a dog lab. And so they've been there. That perspective was really, really fascinating to hear.
Yeah, it's interesting. Again, I've never worked with dogs, so that might have really changed my opinion because, like it or not, I do have that sort of bias towards like pets, dogs that are pets here, or animals that are classically kind of viewed as a member of the family. But even when I think about the work that I did in a lab facility, working with mice, and I personally had to euthanize the mice because I was using embryonic mice. So, I had to sacrifice the mouse in order to take the embryos to get the brain cells from the embryonic tissue to grow neural networks. And I was the one doing it. I was the technician who did that. I think that even looking back, I can justify the work and I can see why it's valid. But there was sort of, I think like many people say, there was just a point where I was like, I don't want to do this work anymore. Like it was very hard at the beginning. It took a long time to physically be able to do it, like with my hands. Once I was able to do it, it became more mechanical. But then there was a point where I was like, okay, I've sort of done my service in this lab, and I don't want to spend the rest of my life, sacrificing mice and doing this kind of research. It doesn't suit me anymore, and it I don't know, that struggle of like, do I feel justified in it? I think I did, but I think it does kind of take a toll as well.
Yeah, that's not surprising. I mean, and I wonder, did you get to a point where you really were disengaging from this? I mean, this being an animal, like very different from your dog at home, or were you able to always see it like this is a living being?
No, it was always a living being for me. And I will say, there were a few times, and like, I can say this now because I no longer have an affiliation with the university, and it's been many, many years. But there were a few times where the company who we would order, so you would order these mice to be like E18 or E15, like the embryonic age, because we wanted them to be old enough, I guess, in utero that certain cellular structures were there, but not so old that they were born. And every so often they would mistime it. And so we would get, the pregnant mouse, and she would give birth before like we were due to do the the sacrifice. And so every so often we would end up with this like pregnant mouse with all these little pups. And sometimes you would put them back into the breeding colony, but like at least on 2 occasions, I was like, "You're coming home with me," and I did. I had like pet mice, and so it was an interesting sort of parallel where I'm in the lab working with these lab animals, and then I'm home and I have these little animals that I'm feeding and like petting and talking to, and I didn't see a difference. They were the same, but then again. And this is like a little soapbox, which I'll get off very quickly. I taught a lot of like dissection also because I was, a university researcher. And so I taught like A&P and introbio and courses like that. And whenever I would teach those labs, I would put the fear of God into my students, like, and this coming from an atheist, but I would be like, these animals gave their lives so you could learn from them, and there will not be a shred of disrespect paid to them. This is a massive sacrifice, and I think that we all have to be very grateful to them. And so we would spend like our whole kind of first day and these are animals that had already been sacrificed, right? Like fetal pigs and things like that they're doing dissection to learn from. But I was very, very reverent towards these creatures because they were alive. And yes, they did give their lives, not knowingly though.
Right.
Like they didn't choose that.
Right. They're not
It's
volunteering
a big
for
deal.
this job.
No. Absolutely not. And so at the very least, however you feel about the approach to working with these, creatures ethically, at the very least, a baseline reverence and gratitude and kind of sanctity, I think, has to be present when you're doing this kind of work.
Yeah. I talked to some researchers who, they would have pictures of the dogs up in their lab, or they would, they would do something to memorialize them after they would euthanize these animals. And the dog researcher, Alexandra Horowitz, she actually wrote a paper that talked about, maybe we need to be, mentioning these animals and thanking them and including them in the papers, because right now it says, 6 female beagles, and you don't know who they are. It's just very generic. So
yeah.
There's certainly more we can do. And if we are going to continue having animals in labs, there's more we can do to make sure that if they are harmed, that there's a real benefit to it. And that maybe there is an upper level of harm. Right now there is not. If the researcher can justify it, it's allowed to happen.
And so the idea, right? The idea is that undue harm should not be caused. Like there are some kind of welfare standards, but they're pretty loose in how they're realized.
That's right. And again, for all the animals not covered under the Animal Welfare Act, that that's not regulated, that's not monitored. So
right.
We just don't know.
Yeah, so dogs in some ways are sort of like a special case because they are covered under the Animal Welfare Act.
Yes, the dogs and primates, and a lot of the warm-blooded animals that are not rodents.
Mm-hmm. The animals that we sort of culturally have deemed cute or like somehow they have an elevated status.
Yes.
Which is, we've got to be honest, it's arbitrary, but it's also the way that things are.
Yes. You mean the way things are, like, say more on that.
Just that, in some ways, like if you try to look at it dispassionately, it is arbitrary. Why do we choose dogs over mice, for example, to have this status in our lives or in our whatever? Why do we have certain rules for the animals that we eat versus the animals that we think should be part of our family? Like that feels very arbitrary. But at the same time, it is the social norm. And because of that, we are not just constrained by it, we are influenced by it. We grow up in a culture and a society where dogs are celebrated. They are cuter. We love them more. They are part of our family. And so what feels like an innate reaction to it, who knows how much of that is innate and how much of that really is kind of culture bound. It probably is mostly culture bound, but it is the way it is regardless.
Exactly. And we domesticated them. Like we asked them to be with us, right?
Yeah, yeah. Absolutely. And so, I'm really curious how your views have changed. You said you went into it with a pretty open mind. Did you have a little bit of a bias one way or another? Did you go into it saying, I'm open and I think that there's probably utility here, but I'm still kind of like, probably we shouldn't be doing research on animals? Or did you really not have an opinion? It's hard to believe you didn't have an opinion, though.
I didn't like it, right? I
Right,
didn't,
right.
I still don't like it. I still want
Hmm.
all the animals out. But I
Yeah.
also know that I've benefited from this. Like, I've had some major surgeries and everything connected to that surgery, blood transfusion and medical devices, and everything was tested on animals before, probably some of them dogs. The
Hmm.
first blood transfusion in the 1600s happened with dogs. And any of us who've taken drugs, which is everybody, right? I mean, they're all tested on animals. And if we're sick, we're going to want to feel better. If we're in excruciating pain, we're going to take some drugs. So, I think just trying to square that that was my mindset heading into this. And I just thought by learning more, I would understand like why it happens, but then also like, does this need to still happen? And I learned a lot about the alternatives and all these non-animal approaches that are being developed. And so, I'm curious, like when you were a student, were they talking about that, or was working on the mice the only option for you?
So in our lab, we need it, like, because this would have been 2005. We didn't have the computational capabilities that we have now to like model neuronal networks and do research with those neuronal networks. And so, yes, everybody was trying to work towards developing computer models of these things. But really, we were using the mice to do that. That was a big part of what our lab was doing. And I think that was a big distinction that was important for me to make when my friends, I had a lot of kind of very lefty activist friends who would be like, it's horrible. You should just use a computer program. And I'm like, I don't think you realize that what I do in the lab is I'm not teaching dissection in the lab. I'm doing research. Like there's a big difference there. And we weren't yet as sophisticated with our modeling techniques to be able to do the type of research that we were doing on real networks, which now I do think that you could use a sort of model of a network to do very similar research. And I think that because of that, those labs are using the animals less and less. But I think that was always a big misunderstanding, is when people were like, why can't you just use a mouse brain software program? And I'm like, because I'm not teaching people where the hypothalamus is. I'm taking the tissue and I'm delivering different drugs to these in vitro neuronal networks.
Right. It's amazing what we can do now. But at the same
Yeah,
time, as we get more advanced, are we going to have more and more questions that need more and more mice?
right.
Because even with all this AI and the computer modeling, I just don't know where this is headed. I mean, certainly the number
Hmm.
of dogs is going down, and there's a lot of energy around putting resources into these non-animal methods,
Yeah.
the organoids and organ chips. And, that's all really positive. But, I just wonder with where we're going, is there going to be some other reason that humans are going to say, well, we need animals for this? Because,
Y- Yeah.
they don't really count. They're disposable in a lot of ways.
Absolutely. And I think that's something that I saw even in my little microcosm was, we could justify in my lab that we were using embryonic mice. So one pregnant mouse was serving something like 40 experiments, as opposed to many labs where it was one mouse, one experiment. So like we were proud of the fact that we could build these neuronal networks and, basically make the donation, the tissue, last so much longer and do more with less. I always enjoyed, for example, teaching dissection where we were utilizing organ systems, like an eyeball of an animal that had already been, processed for food, as opposed to an entire animal, that died just for that purpose. And so it was always like, how can we maximize, or how can we do this in a way that's just that much more sort of ethical or that much more economical? But at the same time, where is that threshold where you no longer need the tissue or the sample at all? And we can just model it fully computationally. And I think we're getting close to that point for like a lot of research. But you're right. It's hard to know what new avenues that opens up then, because when we're talking about like CRISPR and we're talking about the type of biotechnology that's become necessary now, like, of course, we would never have had a COVID vaccine. We would never have been able to do mRNA vaccines if we couldn't at least test this stuff out on animals first.
Right. Yeah. It really is an interesting time, though. I mean, there's so much happening, and I understand a very little bit of it. Most of it goes right over my head. But then I also think about all this human data that we have. Like, everyone's got wearables, and they're tracking their sleep, and there's just so much data out there. So I think just harnessing that, we're going to learn a lot, and also just changing the culture of what students are doing and what postdocs are doing, and understanding that it doesn't have to be with a live animal.
Absolutely. And I've got to ask, I know that I'm keeping you longer than I told you I would, and I'm so sorry, but I've got to ask, cuz like, just from a pure welfare perspective, my experience was always, whether I was in an institution where I was teaching a dissection for an animal that had already been sacrificed, or I was doing animal research, personally, my experience is that the welfare of the animal was like utmost importance, and there was a certain amount of reverence. I don't know how much of that was my own ethics that I was bringing to the table, but it did feel a bit like it was the culture of the labs that I worked in as well. I think it's easy to assume that every facility is similar to like the breeding facility that you described, especially because we've seen so many exposés about like factory farming and just, like PETA undercover kind of exposés. There's a part of me that wants to believe that the actual scientists who do this kind of work have a deep reverence and gratitude for the lab animals that they work with, and do treat them with a lot of respect and with a lot of reverence. But do you think that I'm being naive?
Well, I will say that when there are undercover videos, we're going to see the worst thing that they can possibly find, right? I mean, it's just, they're awful to look at these videos. I can't look at them. I'll see like a second. I'm like, okay, that's enough. Mm-hmm. And the other thing, you talk about the scientists really caring about these animals. I mean, I had several researchers tell me that they are not interacting with the animals. So it's the animal care staff and the technicians and the lab animal veterinarians. And the researchers told me in many cases, they are removed from the animals. They are trying to get grants. So they don't have the same connection. And I do believe that the animal caretakers care about these animals. And, they care about their welfare and enrichment. And if there's little things the mice can dig into for, to keep them busy, or a toy that a dog can play with, they want to be able to have that. And I do believe a lot of people in the labs are thinking about that. But that doesn't change the fact that these animals, whether it's a ferret or a woodchuck or a beagle, they're in the same environment day after day, and they don't have new smells, and they can't do what they're naturally born to do out in the world. And, it's just a pretty sad and boring existence for these animals who are smart and have all kinds of feelings and personalities. So even in the best case scenario, when the welfare is like, the top you can imagine, it's still pretty sucky.
Absolutely. Yes, especially for, I think, well, I shouldn't even make that qualification, but I think about animals that, are wild versus domesticates, and how that rich life that they, evolve to experience, they're being taken so far from.
Yeah, I read something about, a scenario where we would have mice in like a barn and have little chips on them to do whatever research the scientists needed to do. But they could be in a barn and they could dig and they could mate and they could, smell
Hmm.
things and dig out food. And, I don't know if that's possible. I don't know if maybe we skip over that step and just go right to the AI. But,
Right. I
it
could see
just
that being, I
seems
mean, it's
like,
what we try to do with apes, like the few apes that are left in research. I'm not saying anybody does it well, because it's much more difficult to have a naturalistic environment for apes who have a huge, range.
right.
But at least it's what is demanded for apes now. I mean, you can have an issue with the zoo environment. Many people are against apes in a zoo altogether, and I think that's a completely valid stance. But it does appear to be the case that ape researchers, at the very least, are trying to emulate the type of rich environment that a zoo would offer. But that's still not the same thing as being in the wild.
No, 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 no. It's not.
Absolutely not. So I guess
Yeah.
the last thing that I'd like to point to, and then I'll obviously open it up for anything that we may not have gotten to, is that complex positioning that we, as sort of capitalist consumers, find ourselves in, where we are. I can't help but sort of see a parallel with like fossil fuels, right? Like there's a part of us that knows that it's harmful and that we are kind of sacrificing the welfare of these animals to a certain extent to use them in research. And many people talk about it as though it's a necessary evil. We actively utilize fossil fuels right now, and we know the cost that it has on the environment. We also know that there are alternatives. And whether we're talking about the infrastructure in place that's sort of politicizing and actively preventing those alternatives from being utilized or not, the time period that we live in right now is such that we still have to turn the lights on. We still have to put gas in our cars. And you mentioned, if you take medicine, you have benefited from animal research. The same way that if you use transportation, at somewhere down the chain, you're benefiting from fossil fuels, even if we're seeing a shift for the better. And I think that's a complicated position to be in, but I think it's the humble position to be in, to understand that we do contribute to this giant web. And if we're activists, we want to work to help lessen that impact. But I think it's a bit disingenuous to think that somehow, I don't know, somehow we could be where we are right now without it, and that we didn't benefit at all from it.
Yeah, I think about that so much because during the course of reporting on this, I've changed. And as I've become aware of all this, I'm trying really hard to live a smaller life in that I'm trying to consume less and because it is, like you said, this big web, and we do all benefit from this. We can't get away from it. And I feel like some days, oh my gosh, what is not buying this one thing going to do to make a difference? But this is one of the reasons that I wrote the book, is because I think very few people know it's happening, and I want people to know
Hmm.
that it's not just the drugs, right? It's like we use so many pesticides in this country. I mean,
Hmm.
on our all of our crops, and the bug sprays and the rodent traps, and you think about all these chemicals that are out there, whether they're tested on beagles or not. They're out there. We know they cause cancer. Then we need more medication. We need more medical devices. And so I think what I'm trying to do is live a life that doesn't contribute any more of that than is necessary. And it's a high bar, but I started off being a pretty healthy person. I mean, I eat healthy, I don't drink, I exercise, but during this process, I just became so much more aware of how this is all connected.
Yeah, and so it really did affect sort of your lifestyle decisions.
It really did. I mean, I think twice before I buy anything these days.
So I'm curious, do you have another dog? Do you plan to have another dog?
I would be surprised if I didn't have another dog in my life at some point. But right now, I'm just enjoying having Hammy, in my heart and talking about him. And, he's still very much on my mind.
Oh, Hammy. Oh, gosh. We thank Hammy so much for all of his contributions and I don't know, the know-how that we've learned. And we thank you for sort of taking this complicated topic and diving into it in a really kind of honest way, and for spending all the time that it takes to write a book like this, and then for sharing that time with us today on the show. I'm curious, Melanie, before we go, is there anything that we didn't, I mean, there's a million things we didn't get into, but is there anything that we didn't get into that you feel like, oh gosh, no, the listeners, the readers, they need to know this?
I will give a shout out to PETA, because I went into this project knowing, I think what most people know about PETA is that it's a pretty radical group and they do radical things with their demonstrations and protests. And I just became so impressed with their science division. They have a group called Science Advancement and Outreach. And like I said before, a number of their PhDs used to experiment on animals, and then they realized they couldn't do that for their career. And that's where, I learned so much about science through them. They provided a lot of documents that they had obtained. They know so much about these non-animal alternatives. I mean, probably more than most people in laboratories. So I was really blown away that this even exists at PETA. And just really encouraged to know that they're working on this. They also will reach out to companies in a very friendly way and say, hey, can you work on this food additive with alternatives instead of testing on rats? And, so their approach is to try to come to the table with these companies first. And then if the company, ignores them, that's when they put up the big billboard. So
yeah, I was curious. I mean, that actually surprises me as well. That's exciting to hear. Do you think that this has been a sort of slow, steady change in their approach, or has that always been occurring and we just only see sort of the most, extreme activism?
I think it's been a change. I mean, certainly they started out doing undercover investigations, and it was really, the traditional way that we think about PETA in the beginning. But as we know more science and we have these alternatives, and it really takes, a robust group to understand them, and then to be able to go to the researchers and say, hey, you could be doing this without animals. And they're doing that, and they're actually donating some really expensive equipment to, there's something called a smoking robot that tests these like e-cigarettes without having to use animals. And, so they're donating things like that. And they're donating very lifelike frogs for dissection. And so anyway, they're doing a lot of awesome work, which surprised me. And I'm really optimistic about that.
Very cool. Well, gosh, I can't thank you enough. Everybody, the book is Lab Dog, A Beagle and His Human Investigate the Surprising World of Animal Research by Melanie D. Kaplan. Melanie, thank you so much for being here with us.
Well, thank you for the smart questions and the great conversation.
Absolutely. And everybody listening, thank you for coming back week after week. I'm really looking forward to the next time we all get together to talk nerdy.